This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 295. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. There is a terrible, terrible idea that keeps coming back and getting more and more likely to be funded, at least. And that is data centers in space, orbiting satellites that are doing data center-y AI type stuff. Recently, Ars Technica started a 3-part series, the first of which is up already as we record, Orbital Data Centers Part 1. There's no way this is economically viable, right?
And yet, that article spends quite a few words painting a picture of something that, well, maybe this is economically viable. It talks about launch costs, and it talks about people not liking data centers terrestrially as neighbors, and that's all well and good, but it completely fails to address the biggest operational challenges that orbital data centers would have, which power generation is not really the big one. The article goes to a lot of length to talk about how you can generate more solar power in orbit than you can terrestrially, and that is true, but okay, great. Now what do you do with the heat? The article talks about a potential 100 gigawatt power generation satellite. That's an awful lot of heat. How do you get rid of it?
Well, it's cold in space, right? No problem. Except not.
No, it's not. And we'll talk about that in a second. Before we get to that part, though, I would like to point out that, again, the article goes to some length to make sure that you know that one of the complaints people have about data centers is how much water they use. Well, why do they use so much water? For cooling, because data centers generate an enormous amount of heat, and convection cooling with a fluid like water is pretty much the most effective possible way to remove a lot of heat quickly. If we could just passively cool these data centers, it would solve a lot of problems, and we'd be doing that. But it turns out we can't even passively cool these data centers in an atmosphere with constantly circulating, mostly sea level, temperature and pressure air circulating over a radiator. In space, your only option is a literal radiator with no mass connecting to it. You're literally just waiting for this energy to radiate out into space. Your radiator cannot be in the path of the sun, because if it is, you just made a heater, not a heat remover. So you have to do a lot of complex nonsense. You have to make sure everything is always oriented properly. And you still, frankly, again, you're not going to have sufficient heat removal capability, because if you could do that in space, you already could have done it on Earth.
Yeah, we'll link to a piece from Taranis.ie, I think that's how we say it. Data centers in space are a terrible, horrible, no good idea. And this is an anonymous person in Ireland, but they say that they have worked for NASA and stuff and know what they're talking about. And it does sound like they do if you read the whole thing. And it just really sets out, this piece, how ridiculous of an idea this is. I mean, it's as ridiculous as colonizing Mars, almost. Like, yes, there are problems with putting data centers on Earth, power consumption and water and real estate space and all the rest of it, and NIMBYism. But putting this into orbit just makes no sense whatsoever. The idea of this radiator, radiation versus convection. We think of a radiator on a CPU cooler or a GPU cooler or whatever, but we use that word incorrectly, because virtually none of that heat is radiated away. It's taken away via convection, as you said, Jim. And that is just so much easier to do than to radiate that heat away. I mean, and that's just one of the myriad problems with this.
It's incredibly basic physics, incredibly basic. I would also like to point out that the radiator in your car does not remove heat from your motor by radiating it. It is, again, convection. In order of efficiency, convection is the best way to remove heat. Conduction is by far the second best, leaving radiation trailing the pack very far behind in third place. And even in an automotive, quote, radiator, unquote, you're not even relying on just conduction. It's convection on both sides of the loop. You're using convection to get water into the metal of the radiator by way of pumping water rapidly through it, and you're using convection to remove the heat from that metal from the air. And generally in a modern car, you're not even just relying on passive airflow. Even while you're idling parked, you've got a fan that's blowing a ton of air over that quote unquote radiator, because no, it can't radiate your heat. It needs to convect it.
So the biggest problems with the data center in space is you can have these radiators, like the International Space Station on the backside of its solar panels have these kind of radiators to dissipate some of the heat. And like if you're building like a 20 gigawatt solar array, you need like 80% of that as cooling as well. Like you need that much again. But the big difference is those radiators need all that metal in those fins, and they're heavy. And you have to be pumping a liquid through them, right? You have to get the heat from where it is to where the radiator is. And so launching liquids into space is expensive. Liquids are heavy. And the metal for all those fins is also heavy. You know, they built the recent on the International Space Station, they had the rollout solar panel that could basically unfold. It was only like 350 kilograms and it can unfold in this big size. And that's great. You can do that with solar, but you can't do that with the radiator, right? The radiator is not going to be foldy-uppy. It's a giant chunk of metal. And so it's going to be a lot heavier and a lot more expensive to launch. And just because you can get enough power cheaply in space doesn't mean you can dissipate the heat for anywhere near that inexpensively. And then the size, some of these examples, they were talking about this like 4 kilometer square solar grid. If it's light, it's just going to tear itself apart due to the shears from all the different things. And if it's not, it's too heavy to launch and it's not going to work. And then we haven't even talked about the other problems of we have enough problems with space junk now, where it's only like nation states launching things into space and a couple of companies. If we start having kind of unregulated people launching stuff into space, or worse, a bunch of startups that are going to go out of business and abandon their data center in space at some point, who's going to clean that up?
Well, gravity will fix the problem, because especially something like Starlink has to be in a fairly low Earth orbit to get anything even resembling a reasonable latency and internet experience for people. And that means that those satellites do not stay up there forever. In fact, they don't even stay up for very long. And so they end up burning up in the atmosphere, dumping all the chemicals and metals and all sorts. And if you start putting more and more data centers up there, they're going to eventually probably find their way into the atmosphere, which is no good for anyone.
They also have to be pretty small to reliably burn up in the atmosphere. Then beyond that, you have to worry about the impact on literally the night sky. Do you like being able to see the stars? Or do you just want to see the bottom of a ton of garbage AI satellite things? Again, that was assuming this is even viable at all, which it isn't. Even as a terrible idea, we can't make this happen as a terrible idea, let alone a good one. But if we did, the problems would just continue to spiral. Ground-based astronomy already has issues with, satellites creating streaks across images that got considerably worse with Starlink. Somewhat surprisingly for a Musk company, Starlink appears to have been trying to cooperate with astronomers and make their satellites, less visible noisy. But there are still, radio astronomy is still affected. And even with, fewer visible lights and whatnot tarting up these satellites, they are still a problem. And at this kind of scale, if we start saying, we're going to do all the infinitely scaled AI, whatever we want, because now we're dumping it into space. Well, again, do you like being able to see the sky?
Well, yeah, there's tens of thousands of satellites up there right now. And Musk is talking about putting 1 million up there. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
The other thing is you have to look at the motivation. And the motivation most of the time, I don't think, is that the energy is free and it'll be cheaper. The motivation is it'll be unregulated.
Yep.
And what are they trying to do and why are they doing it in a way? Like, do we want them doing things with nobody keeping an eye on them? Like, I don't think in many cases the regulation around this is good enough on Earth. But if they're up there completely unregulated, I think it gets even worse. But I still think, like, even though a Starlink satellite is only designed to last 5 years, most of the time it's still commanded to burn up. If we're waiting for it to burn up and it's just a ballistic object up there, it's just going to smash somebody else's satellite.
Yeah. And there's a big problem that we haven't talked about, and that is reliability of these things. There is a lot of radiation in space, like a lot. And the further out you get, the more radiation you have to deal with. And then you're talking about bit flips and even permanent damage to the core components of these data centers in space.
Well, see, that's simple, Joe. And in addition to the thousands of tons of coolant that we need to ship to orbit, we also ship, maybe 1 million tons worth of water to freeze as ice to make these giant bulky shields that prevents the Casimir radiation from messing with the electronics and satellites. Problem solved, man. Moving back to latency real quickly. And again, I would like to point out latency is the most solvable, least problematic issue this idea has. Starlink right now has by far the best latency that this concept of like an orbital internet connection has ever offered. And it's typically about 30 to 60 milliseconds. That is just to ping the satellite. That means you're adding that 30 to 60 milliseconds on top of every other type of latency that you have in wherever you're trying to actually get to. Is that completely unusable? Obviously not. Starlink has a lot of users that are very happy to have that kind of connection available to them in very remote places. Is it good latency? Absolutely not. It's bad even compared to just LTE, let alone compared to a proper, wired or fiber connection.
Google just patented the end of your website.
Luckily, Google did not patent the clickbait headline because, good Lord, that is a terrible example of it.
Well, it's Forbes. What do you expect?
Yeah, garbage clickbait that doesn't relate to the article. Sure.
At first, I wasn't sure if they meant like something about the footer of my website or something, but no, it means when Google surfaces your website in a search result, it's going to provide an AI summary so people don't have to actually go to your website. So you won't even know that somebody got the information from your website without ever coming to your website.
Well, it's kind of worse than that because that's what they're already doing, right? But this is like they will show you the website, but with an AI, not necessarily summary of it, but like an AI generated page that's tailored to you. Like the Google bubble, but to the max.
Google is no longer simply serving links. It is now pimping links. And I think this is how this is ultimately going to play out. I think this is eventually going to be a pay-for-play kind of a deal where Google is leaning on people. Look, you really want to spend a little bit extra so that you get the individual tailoring to make sure that everybody who sees your website and a link sees the version of the description of your site that is personally tailored to their taste and is the most effective for, what's the word? Conversions. You want those conversions, don't you? Well, pay Google a little bit more to talk a little nicer about you.
That would be all well and good. Well, no, that would be terrible, but it's not even really going to be like that because you can't trust the AI to not just make shit up. Like, do you want this idiot machine to misrepresent your company or organization? I certainly don't.
And neither do I, but let's be honest here. Look around. Overwhelmingly, there are literally billions of people who want precisely that. Now, will they get what they think they're going to get to out of it? No. Do they want it? Yes. Recently, I rather reductively said that, all IT problems boil down to negligence. Well, we're right back in the negligence again. It will be really convenient if I don't have to think about this, and therefore I'm going to say I want this really, really super hard so I can get it and it'll be convenient. Is that a logical error? Absolutely. Is it a very human logical error? Yup.
Do you mean the users or the publishers or both?
I mean all concerned. I mean humans as a class are lazy and negligent. And therefore, we are very, very excited about the idea of AI that will do all of our thinking for us. And everything will just be magic and perfect and wonderful, and it'll be easy, and we won't have to think about anything. Now, if we actually think this through, the problems become pretty obvious. But you see the flaw in that, don't you?
Mm.
The one that I'm worried about for some of this is literally culpability for some of this. For example, earlier today, I was searching for if a certain class of airfare from an airline included access to the lounge or not. And Google confidently said it did in its little AI summary and referenced the airline's website. But Google misunderstood a Class A ticket to mean business class, not a ticket issued with Class A, which is for Aeroplan rewards. And so it was a reward redemption, so it doesn't include this, and it's not a business class seat, it's a premium. Anyway, it confidently gave information wrong, even though it was citing the correct airline's website. It was just taking it out of context and quoting the wrong information.
Right, and to be clear, this was not just slightly wrong. This was a binary question, yes or no, and it said yes when the answer was no.
Exactly. And in particular, it cited the airline's website, even though incorrectly. Now, if this gets to the point where, especially to Jim's point, if Air Canada is paying Google to provide this summary or a better version of it, and it gives you the wrong information, at what point can I sue the airline for not giving me the thing that when I checked on their website, in scare quotes, I was told it was included in my fare? It was published that that fare included that. And then I didn't get it. So where's my money?
Well, that's the thing about lawsuits. You can sue anybody at any time for any reason. That's not the question. The question is simply whether you'll win. Mm-hmm. And there is only one way to find out.
Yeah. But it's just at some point, I'm guessing the publishers of websites are going to be concerned about where the line is between what is their website and what is not. And especially the confusion this will create amongst users if you search for something on Google, you click on it, and instead of going to the website, you get an AI corrupted version of the website, not controlled by the website, but controlled only by Google, that gives you incorrect information.
I mean, again, yes, I agree. These are real problems that people will really come up against. But I also think it's clear that people are very determined to experience those problems directly.
Yeah. Well, and I think Google's very determined to make this happen.
Arguably, I think an even worse example of what you were talking about with the Google AI summary getting things very confidently and very badly and binarily wrong. A recent trip to Vermont, my wife and my kids, they eat pretty much entirely plant-based. And that, gives you some challenges when you're trying to figure out where to stop to eat along the way on a really long road trip. And Google Maps gave us a very enthusiastic recommendation for a place called, I believe it was Lamb of Bread Cafe, something like that. The lamb's bread, bread of the lamb, something along these lines, cafe in rural Maryland. And Google very confidently told us that it had, all kinds of vegetarian and vegan options and, this and that and the other. And it was all just based on Google seeing like bread in the name and its AI deciding, oh, well, that means this will be a vegan place. It was not. That was one of the least vegan restaurants I've ever been to in my entire life. There was nothing a vegan could eat there. And now the restaurant was aware of this. We weren't the first set of vegetarians or vegans or whatever, that had stopped at this place and found that there was literally nothing there they could eat.
You'd think they'd put a couple options on the menu at that point.
Well, you did say rural Maryland. I don't know how many vegans they have in their catchment area. But at the same time, I feel like having lamb in the name maybe was a giveaway that it was not vegan.
Well, it actually isn't, because there's a Lamb's Bread Cafe here in Columbia, South Carolina that is 100% vegan. Uh-huh. Your real clue what lamb and bread both in the name mean is that means it's a Christian establishment. It tells you absolutely nothing about the food, but it tells you whoever is running it is pretty deeply and fundamentally Christian.
Well, I'd be equally as disappointed if I showed up there and I couldn't get lamb to eat.
Well, it's funny. You say bread and lamb, and I think of sweetbread, which is neither sweet nor bread.
It is lamb related. I'll give it that.
Yeah, exactly. Now, boosters, of course, would say, well, this is all going to get fixed. It's going to get more and more accurate as we go along. This is the worst it's ever going to be. So don't worry, it'll get these details right one day. But that's just not how this works, right? Like, it's not getting much better than this.
I mean, it literally can't. If you examine what this feature is intended to do and you try to basically, you try to assume that there is absolutely nobody working at Google who is not an actual Halo sporting saint. So this feature is the best intended version of itself it can possibly be with no grift intended. Well, it's a translation layer. It's basically assuming that the person who created that website and the person who might be interested in browsing to that website don't speak exactly the same language. And the robot can translate from one to the other so they understand one another better. So the website gets users who are more interested in it, and the users have a better idea of what websites they're going to and can choose which one they're going to better. The thing is, why are you expecting that some random AI model has a better idea about the connection between a website and its users than either the users or the website itself does. What's magic about that box in the middle?
And of course, this is just a patent at this stage, so who knows if they'll ever actually do it. It does sound like the kind of shit that they would want to do, so it would not surprise me, but it may never happen.
Who knows? Maybe this is actually a much better world than we believe we live in, and Google actually registered that as a defensive patent to make sure nobody could do this obviously terrible, horrible, bad, no good idea.
Yeah, let's believe that they just want no one to do it. That's great. Bit of optimism for once. Thanks, Jim. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Gouda writes, we have some old Dell R710 and R720 hardware with PERC RAID controllers with some small 10K RPM SAS disks. These machines are around 15 years old, but we want to run Debian and ZFS on them. How do I get ZFS direct access to the disks? I've heard of people flashing PERC controllers to turn them into HBAs. How do you go about doing that?
So that'll depend on the specific PERC controller. Most of the time, that's just a Dell badged version of the LSI controller. And it's usually fairly easy to find out which one it was. And a lot of those have what's called an IT or initiator mode firmware that you can overwrite the existing firmware with, and it basically forgets that it's a RAID controller and just acts as a dumb HBA. And that will just cause all the disks plugged into it to show up as individual disks and not be in RAID. But knowing that the R710 and R720 are old enough, they might be an older generation of the LSI card that's not as easy to do this with.
Yeah, with an R10 and R720, it could go either way. You can get the good perks or the crappy perks out of those things, like straight from Dell. Dell was kind of interchangeably using the two different models of card. The other option, if you discover that your perk is not one that's particularly flashable, and this should be a really easy search, honestly, just hit the search engine of your choice and mention your exact model of perk card and IT mode, and you should very rapidly come up with people's experiences and recommendations, on your specific card. If it turns out you've got the crappy card, or you just don't really feel comfortable with reflashing, you don't have to spend a whole lot of money to get a very good host bus adapter these days. You can hit Amazon, and my usual recommendation is the LSI Broadcom 9300 8i, and those are currently running $80 a pop.
Sometimes you can find the 9207-8i, which is just one generation older, plain HBA, for a bit less, but not always. But yeah, anything of that kind of era there will work great. And I think especially the 9207, there are lots of cheap Chinese knockoffs of it as well.
Although, again, we are talking about your storage, and we are talking about something that, like, the good card, like the really all the way good one, no knockoffs, yes. This is actually, the 9300 8i is already an older generation, don't get me wrong, but it is definitely the one that I would recommend. And personally, at $80, I start feeling like once you start trying to carve costs down much lower than that, you have to ask yourself, like, what am I doing here? Mm-hmm. And what is the value of what I'm doing? Is this really where I want to chop 20 or $30 off the total cost of my system?
Yeah.
And also, I hope your power is cheap if you're going to run hardware this old.
Yeah, so these R710s are Xeon like E5500 or E5600. That is the very beginning of the kind of modern generation of CPUs. So you're talking 15 plus generations old now, equivalent to a very first gen i7 kind of in power usage. So not terribly efficient. And for all that power, you're lucky if you're getting quad core. So these may be of limited value, but, they can also be a decent machine to start from. When hardware is free, it's a lot harder to argue with.
Yeah. And again, it depends where you are. If you're somewhere with a lot of cheap power, then yeah, it makes sense.
I hadn't always considered how big of a difference that makes until talking amongst my team the other day. And there are people that pay about 5 cents US per kilowatt hour, and there are people that pay the equivalent of like 45 cents US per kilowatt hour, depending on where they live. And it's like, wow, that, I knew some places had power that was more expensive, but not 10 times more expensive.
I did want to look up some real world numbers before we moved on from this. An R710 very likely, as Alan mentioned, would have a Xeon E5520 or a pair of them powering it. Now, those were actually surprisingly low TDP parts for Intel of this era. Those were only 80 watt TDP. Now, with that said, that's 80 watts thermal design power each, and that's thermal design power, which is not the same thing as much power as they will draw if given adequate cooling. In reality, with a pair of those things, if you actually saturate them, you're probably going to be pulling about 300 watts just for the processors alone. Now, how does this stack up with something even vaguely recent? And by even vaguely, I decided to go with a 12th generation Intel i5 desktop part. Now, the TDP is actually higher. It's a full 150 watt TDP on the 12th gen i5. However, when we talk about the performance per watt, the Passmark multi-threaded rating on that single Xeon E5 5520 was 2541. For the 12th gen i5, it's 27,559. And when we compare the single core performance, the single threaded rating for the E5520 was 1060. And for the 12th gen i5, which again is getting pretty long in the tooth, it's 3,920, nearly 4 times the performance, even single threaded.
Yeah, and you didn't get that many threads with the E5500 series. The E5520 was only quad or 6 cores?
It was quad core 8 thread.
Although those SAS drives are not going to be much use.
Yeah, they were relatively small, I think 600 gig and 2.4 terabyte. 10,000 RPM is great, but also noisy, uses more power, and that's not that much storage.
I would put those in the skip, personally. 10,000 RPM drives were never great, honestly. I don't think they were ever a very good sacrifice to make for the little bit of additional latency and really no extra throughput that you got out of bumping spindle speeds up to 10 or even 15,000 RPM. It's a tiny, tiny performance difference. And you go from having something that, seems like a hard drive to something that seems like, well, a cross between a coffee grinder and a drill press and a space heater. The amount of noise and heat those old data center grade hard drives created, it has to be experienced to be believed.
The other thing that will likely mean is if those were 2.5-inch drives rather than 3.5-inch drives, you'll have to be probably more choosy about what drives you decide to put in this. If you replace those with something more modern, you might be looking at trying to get SAS SSDs, which is not that easy. Or I guess especially if you replace the controller with one that will definitely support SATA as well, then maybe that's okay, but your options may be limited there as well.
And that LSI 9300 8i that I recommended absolutely supports SATA as well as SAS. Matter of fact, I don't think I've ever used one with SAS drives. I've always used them with SATA SSDs. And the occasional SATA Rust drive. But mostly solid-state drives.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.